Part 1. Shadows at the edge. I used to think my apartment was too small to ever feel unsafe. One hallway, 2 rooms, open kitchen. Nothing complicated, nothing to hide in. That was before I started noticing the shadows. It began with something simple, a dark blur at the edge of my vision. I'd glance over expecting to see the coat rack or a stray bag left on the floor. Instead, the space was empty, too empty, like the air itself had shifted to make room for something else. The hallway light was always on at night. Not because I was scared, but because it made the space feel warmer, less like a narrow throat leading into the dark. That's why it didn't make sense when I started waking up to find it off. At first, I blamed the cheap switch. Old wiring, maybe. But one night, I got up for water around 2 a.m., and as I stepped into the kitchen, I caught it. The light went out on its own. Not a flicker, not a dimming, a sudden, decisive click. My chest tightened. I stood frozen, water glass in my hand, staring down the hallway that now looked twice as long as I remembered. The far end was black, not the absence of light. It was thicker, heavier, like the dark itself was leaning toward me. From then on, I started keeping my phone by my bed. Not for calls, just for the flashlight. Still, every so often, I'd catch that flicker of movement right at the edge, right before my head turned. Like someone was waiting for me to notice. It reminded me of a story I read online. A man in Queensland who swore his hallway stretched whenever the light went out. He said the shadows felt almost aware. I used to laugh at things like that. Now, I kept my bedroom door closed at night and locked. Part 2, footsteps between rooms. I woke up to the sound of movement. It wasn't loud, not enough to be obvious, but it was there. A faint, deliberate shift in weight on the floorboards. The kind you only hear when the house is still, when every sound carries. I held my breath and listened. 1, 2, 3 soft creaks, heading from the living room toward the kitchen. Then nothing. I told myself it was the neighbors. The building was old. Maybe sound traveled through the walls in strange ways. But the truth? I knew my own floorboards. I knew exactly which steps made which sound, and those steps had come from inside my apartment. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, the footsteps didn't stop in the kitchen. They paused. Then they turned and started coming toward my bedroom. I sat up in bed before I even realized what I was doing. The sound stopped instantly, like whoever was walking froze the moment I moved. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was thick, as if the air was waiting to see what I'd do next. Some part of me wanted to swing the door open and prove there was nothing there. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for my phone, hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. A narrow cone of light hit the bottom of my door, painting it in pale white. I swear, for just a moment, I saw a shadow pass across the crack at the bottom. A friend of mine once told me about the night she heard someone walking between her rooms while she was home alone. She'd called the police, convinced it was an intruder. They found nothing. No signs of entry, no footprints, nothing missing. But she moved out a week later. The next morning, I found the kitchen chair pulled out from the table. I hadn't used it the night before. Part 3, the door that opened itself. It was raining that night. The steady hiss of water against the windows almost made the apartment feel safe. Almost. I'd gone to bed early, but sleep didn't come. The sound of the rain was joined by something else. A faint rattle. Not from outside. From the hallway. I propped myself up on one elbow, straining to listen. The rattle grew into a slow, scraping sound, like metal against wood. I realized it was the doorknob to my bedroom. It was turning. Every muscle in my body locked up. The click of the latch echoed far too loudly in the stillness. Then, slowly, the door began to open. The gap widened inch by inch until the sliver of hallway came into view. The light out there was off, but I could see enough to know there was something. A shadow that didn't match the frame of the door, blocking part of the dark. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there. I wanted to call out, to say something sharp, make it retreat, but my throat refused. Instead, I slid my hand under the blanket, gripping my phone like a weapon. The glow of the screen lit my face for just a second. And in that second, the shadow shifted. Not away. Forward. The door opened wider, slow enough that the hinges didn't creak. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear the rain anymore. And then, just when the gap was wide enough for someone to step through, it stopped. We stayed like that, me in bed, it in the doorway, for what felt like an entire minute. Then, with no warning, the door closed again, quietly. I lay awake until the sun came up, the knob still faintly cold when I finally touched it. A woman from a small town in Maine once wrote about something similar, a door in her house that would open by itself on rainy nights, always slowly, always without sound. She swore she could feel eyes on her before it shut. I keep my door locked every night now, but I still wake up at 3 a.m., certain I'll hear that latch again. Part 1. Curtains that never stayed closed. When I first moved into the apartment, the view from my bedroom window didn't seem like much. A narrow street, a row of older houses across the way, most of them rented to students or young couples. It wasn't exactly picturesque, but it was quiet. The window had heavy curtains, thick enough to block the morning light. I liked that. I kept them drawn most of the time, only pulling them back to let in a little air at night. But within the first week, I noticed something strange. Every morning when I woke up, the curtains would be slightly open, just enough to see out. At first, I thought I was just being careless. Maybe I'd left them like that without realizing, but it happened again and again. Always the same, a narrow slit, just wide enough for someone to see in. The odd thing was, I'd wake up feeling watched. Not the vague paranoia you get from being alone too long. This was sharper, focused. Like there was a presence on the other side of that glass, still lingering in my head after I opened my eyes. I started checking the street every morning. Usually it was empty. But once, around 6 a.m., I saw a man standing on the sidewalk across from my building. He was facing my window, not looking at his phone, not smoking, just standing. When I blinked, he was gone. I remembered reading about a woman from a small town in Illinois who had a similar problem. Her curtains never stayed closed. She woke one night to find them fully open and a faint imprint of a hand on the glass from the outside. She moved a month later. I thought about that story every time I went to bed, and every morning I woke up to that same narrow slit. Part 2. A face in the glass. It was just after midnight when I saw it for the first time. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I caught movement in the reflection of the darkened screen. Something pale, framed by the narrow opening in the curtains. I turned my head slowly, telling myself it was just the streetlight catching a branch or a trick of my tired eyes. But there it was, a face. Not pressed up against the glass, but close that I could see the faint outline of features in the dim light. I froze, staring back at it. The shape didn't move, didn't flinch when I sat up. Just stayed there. I didn't want to get closer, but I had to know if I was imagining it. I slid out of bed, moving toward the window on my toes so the floorboards wouldn't creak. When I reached the curtains, I yanked them shut. The motion felt like it should have broken whatever was there, but instead I heard a faint, steady breath. My phone slipped a little in my hand. I pulled the curtain back a couple of inches, just enough to peek outside. The street was empty. The sidewalk, the parked cars. Nothing. I shut the curtains again, this time pulling them tight and clipping them together in the middle so they couldn't move. It didn't matter. The next morning, there was that same narrow slit. A guy from Ontario once posted about waking to see a face outside his second-story window. No balcony, no ledge. He swore it smiled before fading into the dark. I thought about that when I went to bed the next night, and how he said the thing never pressed against the glass. It only ever looked in from just far enough away to keep you guessing. That night, I slept with the lights on. Part 3. The knock after midnight. The first knock came at 12:14 a.m. 3 sharp taps against the glass. Not the hollow rattle of wind-blown branches. This was deliberate. A rhythm with weight behind it. I sat up instantly, my pulse hammering. The curtains were shut tight, clipped in place just like I'd left them. The room was silent again, but the quiet felt different now, like it was bracing for something. I reached for my phone, but before I could unlock it, the second knock came. Softer this time. Closer. As if whoever or whatever was out there had leaned in toward the glass. I told myself not to look. If I didn't see it, maybe it wouldn't matter. But the air in the room felt heavier with each second I waited. Finally, I stood and crept toward the window. When I reached it, I pressed my palm lightly against the curtain, half expecting to feel cold air seeping in through a gap. Instead, there was warmth, like the heat from a face just on the other side. I held my breath and pulled the fabric back a fraction of an inch. The street was empty, but the faint impression of fingertips, 5 clear marks, was visible against the glass. They faded even as I watched, vanishing as if the heat was being pulled back. The rest of the night, I didn't move from my bed. Every small sound from the street made me flinch. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I thought I heard the faint creak of footsteps moving away, each one more distant than the last. A man on one of those paranormal story forums once wrote about a knocking that followed him to 3 different apartments. It always started the same way, slow, patient taps against his bedroom window after midnight, and it always ended with him moving somewhere else. I started looking at new listings the very next morning. Part 1. Creaks from the ceiling. I'd only been in the new place for 2 weeks when I noticed the hatch. It was directly above my bed, a square cut into the ceiling with a thin wooden cover, the kind you could push up from underneath. The landlord called it attic storage, but I never planned to use it. I didn't like the idea of having something right over me while I slept. For the first few nights, I barely thought about it. But then I started hearing the noises. Not random settling sounds, but slow, deliberate creaks, as if weight was shifting just above my head. It was always around the same time, between 1 and 2 a.m. The first night, I told myself it was the building contracting from the cold. The second night, I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the blanket. By the third night, I was wide awake before the sound even started, just waiting. There'd be silence at first. Then one step, pause, another step, and then the faintest scrape, like something being dragged across the wooden floor above me. One afternoon, I decided to check it out in daylight. I pushed a chair under the hatch, climbed up and pressed against the cover. It was heavier than I expected. When I finally got it open, a warm, dusty smell drifted down. The space was small, maybe 4 feet high, with insulation lining the walls and a narrow beam running through the center. Nothing unusual, except for one thing, a small old-fashioned oil lamp sitting directly above where my bed would be. I hadn't put it there. The landlord swore the attic was empty when I moved in. I left it where it was, but that night the creaks came back, louder this time, and I couldn't stop thinking about that lamp, waiting above me in the dark. A woman online once described hearing footsteps in the attic above her bedroom for months. When she finally checked, she found a chair positioned directly over her bed. She never found out why. Part 2, breathing in the dark. It was just after 1 when I woke up. Not to a sound, but to a feeling. The kind that makes your skin prickle before you even open your eyes. The room felt occupied. I lay perfectly still, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, the faint, slow rhythm of breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from above. Not through the walls or from outside, but directly from the attic space above my head. I could hear the air moving in and out, slow and steady, as if someone was lying just inches above the thin layer of wood and insulation. I held my breath, hoping the sound would stop. It didn't. It grew louder, closer, until I could hear the faint catch at the end of each exhale. I thought about getting up, leaving the room, but the idea of stepping out of bed made my chest tighten. If something was up there, I didn't want it to hear me move. So I stayed still, phone in hand, staring at the ceiling. The breathing paused once, long enough for me to think maybe it was over. Then I heard the faint scrape of wood. The hatch cover shifted. Not enough to open, just enough to creak. I pulled the blanket over my head, curling in on myself like a child. The air under the covers grew warm and stale, but I didn't care. I waited, counting the seconds, until the breathing finally faded into silence. In the morning, I checked the hatch. The cover was slightly askew, tilted just enough to reveal the shadowed seam. I could see a faint smear of dust along the edge, like something had brushed against it from the other side. A man on a ghost forum once claimed he heard breathing through his ceiling for weeks before anything else happened. The night before he moved, the attic door was open all the way. I didn't sleep the next night. Part 3. The shape in the hatchway. It happened on the coldest night of the month. The wind outside rattled the loose siding, but that wasn't what woke me. It was the creak, heavier than usual, sharp enough to snap me out of the shallow sleep I'd been clinging to. I opened my eyes to find the hatch cover already moved. Not tilted this time. Pushed fully aside, leaving a dark square in the ceiling above my bed. The streetlight outside caught just enough of the edges to outline the opening, and in that frame, something was there. A shape, crouched, unmoving, its outline too solid to be a trick of the shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. I felt it. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, but I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the blackness above. For what felt like minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the shape began to lower itself. One pale hand slid into view, fingers curling around the edge of the hatch. The skin looked wrong. Too smooth, too light, as if it hadn't touched sunlight in years. My body finally caught up with my fear. I rolled off the side of the bed, hitting the floor harder than I meant to, and scrambled toward the door. Behind me, the faint sound of something shifting its weight onto the frame of my bed. I didn't look back. I ran into the hallway, slammed the door, and locked it. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner of the living room with every light on, listening for movement from the bedroom. There was none. When morning came, I opened the door just enough to see inside. The hatch was closed, exactly how I'd left it days before. No sign of the hand, no trace of the shape. Someone once wrote about finding an old oil lamp in their attic, placed right above their bed. The next week, they woke to see a figure leaning halfway through the hatch. They moved out the same day. I haven't gone back to my bedroom since. The thing about these stories is they don't end when the night is over. You can pack a bag, change the locks, move across the country, but the memory follows you. It sits in the back of your mind like a shadow in a doorway, waiting for the right quiet moment to step forward again. Long after the lights are on, after the rooms are filled with morning noise, you still feel it. That pause before turning a corner. The urge to glance over your shoulder when you're certain you're alone. It's not the noise or the movement you remember most. It's the certainty that something was aware of you. I think that's why these moments stay sharper than most memories. They're not built from the details you can explain, but from the ones you can't. The way your breath changes without you telling it to. The way the air feels heavier when you know eyes are on you. The people who told me these stories still talk about them like they happened last week. Some don't sleep in the same rooms anymore. Some can't stand closed curtains. A few won't even live above the first floor. Maybe you believe it's all coincidence. Old houses, bad wiring, shifting shadows. Maybe you'll tell yourself that right now, as you glance around your own room. But if you've ever had that moment, that sudden tightening in your chest, because you knew, not thought, knew, you were being watched,